Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown's live stream, which is the 6th week that we're running this. It's amazing that we've been here for 6 weeks on the trot. It seems a lot longer for those of us that have been having to deal with the coronavirus lockdown and being isolated. Delighted to be here again to welcome Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, MP for the Cotswolds. And also we've got a guest speaker, which is Mark Booth, a local businessman, who's going to give us his take a bit later on in the programme on what's going on in the business community and how he thinks we could start to come out of the coronavirus lockdown. As before, we're going to focus very heavily on Sir Geoffrey's welcoming remarks and then take your questions and answers as they come. And we've got a very interesting video halfway through the programme to update you on an exciting initiative in Cirencester, which is to do with the Cirencester Community Response COVID-19 group, which are doing some really exciting things in Cirencester. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
David, as always, thank you very much indeed for comparing this session, and also the Barn crew for all the technical expertise that they do in allowing us to be here in this great setting. So thank you for watching this week's Vital Q&A. The main focus of this session will be how do we ease the lockdown and slowly restart the economy without, of course, causing a second spike in the virus. I'll give firstly a brief update on the latest government announcements, and we'll be answering after that as many questions as possible that have been submitted this week. And I think it's one of the features, David, each week we seem to get more questions. I don't know whether that shows that the population out there is more worried about what's happening or whether they're more interested in this process, but whatever.
Yeah, we've had more questions this week, Sir Geoffrey, than ever before, and it's interesting how they're changing from people being worried about where they get their prescriptions to some genuine concerns about the economy and what's happening, which is why Mark's here to help contribute to that debate.
So some of you may have seen yesterday an article on the front page of the Times with my views on how we get out of this lockdown, and during subsequent interviews with the Today programme, Radio 5 Live and Sky News. I believe that if the government want people to act responsibly, they need to be more transparent with us all. This is where there have been a considerable number of constituents contacting me since my last Q&A on when the government will ease the lockdown. And the government has provided a very generous package to support businesses, providing a whopping £330 billion in loans and guarantees. However, we need to get the balance right, recognising the demographics of this particular constituency of the Cotswolds, which has a significant percentage of retired people, as well as a young workforce. So we couldn't have a constituency with both sides of the spectrum, which shows it's how difficult the decision is for the government how we get out of this lockdown. However, we must continue to work together, and we must protect the NHS while seriously considering the long-term impacts for businesses and our economy. All of this has to be, of course, based on the scientific advice, and the government has determined that the current measures must remain in place for at least the next 3 weeks. They've set out 5 specific measures that we need to reach. Firstly, we've obviously got to protect the NHS. Secondly, we've got to see a sustained and consistent fall in the daily death rates. Third, we need to have reliable data from SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. Fourth, we need to be confident that the range of operational challenges, including testing capacity, PPE, are in hand with sufficient supplies across the entire NHS and care sector. And fifth, and this is really crucial, we need to be confident that any adjustments to the current measures will not risk a second peak in infections that overwhelm the NHS. The worst thing we could do now is ease up too soon and allow a second peak of the virus to hit the NHS and hit the British people. People and businesses deserve to know what lockdown ending will look like as soon as possible. Many businesses will need to understand and prepare to open under certain measures, ensuring the safety of their staff and customers. It will not surprise you to know that I've been contacted by many businesses who, despite generous government packages, will struggle and are struggling to operate under these conditions much longer. One industry that's under particular pressure and threat at the moment, and many people about have emailed me, is the environmental horticultural sector, which of course vitally supports the garden sector. And it predominantly has its main season between April and June, so it is particularly vulnerable during this period. I have been in touch with the DEFRA Secretary George Eustace as to how this sector could be supported. I'd like to move on to a more local issue now, and that is the issue of business grants, which I know there have been a lot of controversy and questions about, and if you're one of those businesses, it's really important. So there are in the Cotswold District Council area 1,359 business properties that have already received grants as part of the government's small business grants scheme. In total, the government have provided more than £16,965,000, which has made its way to small businesses in the area. The funding is provided to local authorities, like the Cotswold District Council and the other council I represent, Stroud, to offer grants up to £10,000 to small businesses and up to £25,000 for eligible leisure, retail and hospitality businesses. In total, the Cotswold District Council has been provided with £37,464,000. So they've given out roughly just under a half of what the total. And that could help as many as 2,909 businesses in this local area. The grants paid out by Cotswold District Council, I have to say, are largely in line with the other 5 local authorities in Gloucestershire. Moving on to some other essential parts of government policy in this coronavirus. From today, all essential workers in England and their households will be able to get a test for coronavirus if they need it, giving our key workers the reassurance they need to know that they won't put others at risk by going to work doing their vital jobs. Starting today, all essential workers and members of their household showing coronavirus symptoms will also be able to book a test directly online. All new network of diagnostic laboratories, the biggest in Britain, has been completed in 5 weeks, enhancing our national testing capability, which will be so vital in our battle against coronavirus. Every day across the country, we are increasing our coronavirus testing capacity as we strive to meet our ambitious target of 100,000. The new mega labs in Glasgow, Milton Keynes and Cheshire, which can be scaled up to the tens of thousands of samples, have been added to that effort. Working closely with industry partners and our world-leading universities, we can meet our testing ambition together, meaning we can test our key frontline workers and ensure that those that test negative for the virus can return to work safely. Businesses will receive almost £10 billion in business rate relief this year, which we've already talked about. And we all recognise the impact that the current lockdown measures are having, which is why we put in place an unprecedented support for businesses. Businesses in retail, leisure and hospitality sector play a vital role in our communities. And the government is continuing to work around the clock to get frontline NHS care workers the equipment they need. And I'm sure today we will be talking about PPE. Global supply chains of PPE are under pressure. You can imagine that every single country in the world is homing on suppliers of PPE. And while there is a huge demand for equipment at this time, the government is buying millions more and working with British manufacturers and our international allies to secure months more of supplies, so that our incredible frontline staff always have the equipment that they need to do their roles. Since this pandemic began, as David has reminded us, well over 6 weeks ago, we have delivered over 1 billion items of protective frontline clothing, and we will continue to work around the clock to provide every possible domestic and international option for PPE procurement. The government have boosted the funding for Victim Support Service to ensure that victims of crime have remote access to the support they need during the coronavirus pandemic. A funding boost of 600,000 will give victim services and the charities they support and they need to support the victims remotely by allowing helplines to stay open employing more support workers to handle calls, and helping to fund technology needed from other forms of contact, such as video calls and online chat services. David, I think with that short introduction, I'm sorry that was slightly jumbled, but I hope that it gave some useful information, and I'm happy to answer any questions that any of your contacts may have.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. And as before, what we're doing is we're taking questions that people have sent in on previous live streams first, because inevitably what happens at the end of each live stream is that we haven't got to the end, so we're going to try and pick up on those very, very quickly. We're then going to deal with the questions that we've received since last Friday, and then pick up on the live stream as quickly as possible, because we're sure that the theme that Sir Geoffrey wants to discuss today is the thing that we're primarily focused on, which is the idea of can we restart the economy but do it safely. So the initial questions are, as I said, not necessarily related to that. Here's an anonymous question, but it picks up on the issue of the grants. As a local businessman, I have applied for the £10,000 grant and was dismayed to hear last week on your programme that none of the grants had been paid out by CDC. I've been informed that you have chased the council to find out what is going on. Have you had a reply? I think you've answered that in your opening remarks.
I have, David, and I wish to correct, if I gave a misleading impression last week, I think there were some businesses that had actually had payments. There may be a lag, I think, in the processing of the grants at the District Council and them passing it to their payment department, but I'm hoping that that logjam is now unblocked and people will now beginning to get the money if they'd not already had it.
Okay, so you as our MP are happy, and your
I'm
relationship...
not happy. I'm never happy until 100% of those grants are paid out. I will, in my conference call this coming week, be raising it again with the District Council to see what progress they've already made.
I think this is another point that I'd just like to highlight, which is that your relationship with the District Council and with the County Council is very sound, and you're able to have a proper dialogue, free flow of information, and that works very, very well. And one of the suggestions that we might like to consider is to see whether we could get Councillor Joe Harris to join us on this programme and for you to join him on his programme. That's a thought for the future. It would be quite interesting.
We mustn't have too much peace and harmony.
Right, the next question. Is from Stuart Russell. I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say how keen we are to find a solution to the current pandemic and to rebuild our economy. In looking at the experience of other countries, I'm struck by the fact that in several places the population as a whole are wearing face masks whilst maintaining social distancing and going back to work. The facts about masks speak for themselves. Should we be moving towards a position of supplying the whole population with face masks to be worn at all times? Do you have a view on that?
Well, I think there are one or two things to say about this. Of course, face masks, I think wearing face masks must be better than nothing at all. But before the government issued that advice, they must be very clear on what the supply chains are, because the last thing we would want to do is ask the vast bulk of the British population to wear face masks and then find that there weren't enough actually to service our frontline workers in the health service and the care services. So I think the government must be very mindful of that. Whether they will go to the extent of asking us all to wear masks when we go out, I think remains yet to be seen, and I wouldn't want to preempt that.
Okay, that's great. We've got two questions from a lady called Mrs. Greta Mattingly, who lives in Cirencester. And these relate to her experiences over the Easter weekend when she had to go into hospital, Gloucester Hospital, with a heart-related condition as opposed to COVID-19, and she remained in Ward 7A for 2 days. And she was taken through the red door as I presented with a cough, but when I got up to the ward, I was put into isolation as the ward had 19 patients with COVID ID, and then half the rest of the other were regular admissions. She wanted to say two things. Firstly, she couldn't praise Stroud Ambulance Service enough and wanted that to be mentioned on the programme. But equally, she is concerned that you made a statement that PPE was in good supply, and that you, together with your other MP colleagues representing Gloucestershire, had got a good stock of PPE into the county, and she wanted you to reassure her that the brave staff working in our Gloucestershire hospitals will have the current required protection very soon. And of course the numbers are scary in terms of how many bits of PPE we need to bring into regular supply. So have you got a comment on PPE in Gloucestershire?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say, well, two things really. I hope that Greta is now fully recovered from her heart condition, and I so agree with her that we cannot stint in our praise for our ambulance drivers, all of our health workers, indeed all of the workers in the front-line care sector. That absolutely goes without saying. PPE is a very movable feast, if I may say so. One day, an organisation can have enough, and then the next day they suddenly find that they are beginning to run out, because the government is inevitably having to run this almost on a just-in-time. You don't get any more until you are actually beginning to get short of your last delivery. So your supplies are only really as good as your next delivery. And I know that's not terribly satisfactory, but in a situation, as I've already explained in my opening remarks, where there is a worldwide shortage of PPE, the government is doing its very best to source it from wherever it is. And I know we may have questions on PPE, and it may be that others in the clothing trade have offered to manufacture masks or whatever. But there's no point accepting those offers, David, until the NHS, Public Health England, are absolutely certain that those supplies are going to meet the technical requirements, because there's no point asking people to wear masks or indeed any other protective clothing until they're absolutely certain that it meets the technical standards.
That's great. That brings us up to speed in terms of the questions from previous weeks. I believe that we've covered every question, and thank you, Sir Geoffrey, for doing that. If people want to see the previous live streams, they are available on the Barn Theatre Facebook page and indeed Cirencester Chamber of Commerce, if you want to look back. If we haven't answered a question or missed it, please, please, please let me know, and then I'll make sure Sir Geoffrey answers it. I'd now like to take the opportunity, I think it would be appropriate if you introduce Mark Booth, just to welcome him here, and then we're going to ask Mark a few questions as a local businessman, because we've got questions now about business and health and managing that whole debate. So would you like to welcome Mark Booth?
Indeed. I'm very pleased to welcome Mark Booth. Mark is one of our largest businessmen in Cirencester. He has a diversified portfolio of businesses. He's always looking to improve the general business ambiance of Cirencester, and I know that this particular coronavirus has hit him very hard. So it's good to hear from a big business, a local business that's trying to help the local people, but is suffering grievously in this coronavirus. Mark, you're very, very welcome indeed, and we look forward to what you're having to tell us about your business.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey.
We've got 3 or 4 questions we want to ask Mark, and then Mark very kindly said he'd like to contribute to the debate about business-related questions. So when we get business questions going forward for the rest of this session, Sir Geoffrey will answer them, and Mark will also try and make a contribution as a local business owner. But he said he's here today not just to represent his own businesses, but to represent the business community, and he's made himself available today, and I'm sure he'd happily take comments direct from people who wish to talk to him after this. He's also someone who's been very involved in the retail forum in Cirencester when it was run by the Town Council, and he's been instrumental in setting up a new forum called the Cirencester Town Centre Business Forum, which indeed was the organisation that started this whole live stream. So big thank you to Mark. So Mark, can I ask you the first question? Could you just outline briefly for the audience the various businesses that you are responsible for in Cirencester, just to give people a flavour of who you are?
Sure. Thank you, David. Yes, my business interests are largely focused in the centre of Cirencester. They are a combination of trading businesses, and the principal businesses in that respect are the King's Head Hotel, Made by Bob Restaurant, the Cornhall Delicatessen. We own and operate the Cornhall and the markets that run in the Cornhall. We have a portfolio of property assets throughout the centre of Cirencester that is a mix of residential, and that is private rented, and student accommodation. And then a variety of commercial properties throughout the centre of town that is a mixture of retail, restaurants and cafes, small office suites, it's largely focused in the centre of Cirencester.
I am right in thinking that you have, as some of your tenants, national retailers right through to small independents, don't
Yep.
you? And they're all hurting in different ways. So I think WH Smith and businesses of that size are, and the bank even, Barclays Bank, are tenants of yours. Could you just give a flavour, because you were one of the first people in Cirencester to react, which is what prompted these live streams. You had a sense that something quite serious was about to happen even before the lockdown started. Could you give us a sense of how you reacted as a businessman to prior to the lockdown and then when the lockdown kicked in?
Yes, I think we have to differentiate between a landlord's actions, and then as an owner and operator of trading businesses, how we manage those businesses. As a landlord, we've had to carry on doing our job of managing the freehold properties that we own on behalf of our various tenants, be they residential or commercial. But as a trading business, that's a very different picture altogether. And in terms of the hotel, which is certainly our largest business asset, we had probably a week of not really knowing where we stood. I understand entirely the government's emerging policy, but I think it was probably the week after the Cheltenham Festival. We knew we had to enforce social distancing requirements within the public spaces within the hotel. We actually saw quite a pickup in reservations, probably from people who'd cancelled overseas trips but were looking for a staycation visit to the hotel. So there was a period where we thought we might be able to continue trading, albeit on a restructured basis. But by the end of that week, I think the government issued their directive that hotels, along with other hospitality businesses, had to close, and the doors have been closed since then. We've furloughed those members of staff that we felt were appropriate for the furlough scheme. We've reinvented or relaunched Made by Bob and the Cornwall Delicatessen to provide a sort of social distancing outlet for food and provisions, which has been growing in popularity in the last, whatever it is, 4 or 5 weeks. We've tried to be as creative as we can be, but we're all operating from very restricted circumstances.
Thank you. And could you give us an indication as to the support that you've actually had so far from central government? Sir Geoffrey painted a picture whereby CDC were in line with other local authorities in terms of issuing of grants, but can you give us a flavour as a businessman about how that's not only affected you but some of your tenants?
Sure. Well, I think by far the biggest component of the government's aid schemes from our perspective is the furlough scheme. Across those businesses that I've mentioned, we probably account for over 100 staff who will be part of that furlough scheme. We're waiting with bated breath to see what happens between now and payday at the end of the month. In theory, all the systems are in place, and I know what announcements the government has made, but it's going to be critical for many businesses across the country, as well as in the Cotswolds, for that furlough scheme to start working and for the funds to start flowing through. Otherwise, there's an awful lot of employees who are going to miss their paycheck at the end of this month. As far as the grant scheme is concerned, linked to lower valued or lower rateable value properties, I'm aware, both from ourselves as trading businesses and as a landlord of other tenanted businesses, that tap has started to be turned on this week. We know that funds have started to flow through. I don't believe it's all arrived, but I couldn't comment on where we're at in percentage terms. What I would say is that I think the cap that the government have placed on the rateable value limit is unfair and cumbersome. I know that there are many businesses that are going to fall through the gaps, and I know that the policies that the government have put in place have had to be enacted very quickly. So I realise it wasn't a perfect solution by any means, but the Chancellor has shown himself capable of adapting and listening and responding, and I think that rateable value cap is certainly one area that needs to be looked at, as well as the grants support for larger businesses than are capable of being supported by that grant scheme. And I say that by moving on to the business interruption loan scheme, which, from my perspective and what I read in the press, is just woefully falling short of what the government's expectations were. And I largely put that down to the banks. If you have a system that requires the banks to be in the middle of the chain, if you like, then I feared at the outset, and I think I was here, Sir Geoffrey, on your first broadcast from this theatre, and my prediction at that time, at the very early stages, was that if any scheme that required the banks to process it was always going to run into difficulties. And I think that's what we're finding. Whether the Chancellor should look to increase the percentage covered, whether there is another conduit through which the funds can be released, but there must be many businesses, and certainly ours included, who are suffering very serious hardship. And I guess with all of this, what we're looking for is some semblance of an economy to still exist when the lockdown is over, and jobs are already being lost, and a lot more will be lost unless a solution is found. And I, certainly from my own perspective, I just don't see the business interruption loan scheme as it's currently structured working.
That's a very interesting point, because actually that sort of leads us into the last question, which is, do you think, as a local businessman, that it is possible to restart the economy and to do it in a safe way? Do you have a perspective on that? Because we're going to take questions on that, because that's key to what Sir Geoffrey was saying in his welcoming remarks. Do you share his desire to see that happen?
I definitely think there has to be a balance. I'm not privy to the medical experts. I don't claim to understand the real threats from the virus, but the statistics that we all observe every evening are what they are. As I've said, I think there is untold damage being done to the economy at the moment. I understand why we're in lockdown, and I think largely everyone has embraced that. We've all learned to live life differently over the last 5 or 6 weeks. But I've also observed those businesses that have been able to carry on trading, adapting. And I'll give you an example. The independent bike works shop off Blackjack Street, which is able to carry on trading. They have their door locked, but you knock on the door or ring the bell, you're allowed in. I don't know whether it's one at a time or two at a time, but they're able to carry on providing a service. And I guess that's a form of the type of policy that's being adopted at supermarkets, at petrol stations. And it's possible to see how that could be rolled out across other businesses that are not necessarily essential to our day-to-day function, but are nevertheless desirable from us trying to emerge into some sort of more relaxed behaviour. And I think the population can now be trusted to a large degree. We've learnt our lesson. We're all behaving largely in a much more responsible way. But just to give you an example from the other end of the spectrum, if you look at the fashion industry, so we could apply that approach that the Independent Bike Works is using with fashion shops. But then if someone was to try on a dress in a fashion shop, you've still got the one in, one out, you've still got the controlled access and the social distancing. But if a dress has been tried on and not purchased, what happens to that dress? Does it go back on the shelves or back on the racks? Does it get thrown in the bin? Does it get put in the storerooms and steam cleaned? What do you do? I think there are a lot of challenges, but I do share Geoffrey's view that somehow we've got to find a way of loosening the shackles and allowing us to behave responsibly, but allow business to start emerging in some way, shape or form. Certainly my example with, my own personal example with Made by Bob is we're not doing it to expect in any way to be making a profit. We're largely using it to provide a service to the community and to put our non-furloughed staff to good use. But I think there must be many businesses around that would like to do the same if some sort of relaxation could be found.
That's fantastic, Mark. I would just like to say at this juncture that to have Mark here is a wonderful opportunity for us and for you, Sir Geoffrey, because of his spectrum of business interests, and you've really given us a flavour of that today, and delighted that you're going to be here to contribute to some of the other questions that we're getting in. And on the live stream, the questions are clearly, on the one hand, you've got people concerned about the health issue, and on the other hand, you've got people who are saying we need to restart the economy. So the debate is a very much a live debate. Before we go back to the questions, would you like to make any observations on what Mark's said, Sir Geoffrey, before we carry on with the questions?
I think, Mark, and thank you for those remarks, Mark. I think Mark has graphically indicated the difficulty for the entire country if we don't begin to start to lift these lockdown. And I think we could do it slowly. He's given one or two examples. I could give one or two other examples. I see no reason why we shouldn't slowly open garden centres, maybe even estate agents, businesses that have responsible social separating, and then just see whether there is a huge increase in cases or not. And if there isn't, then you move on to a few more shops and maybe the schools opening. I think we need to do this by a step-by-step basis. And as Mark said, and I made this point in my Today programme interview yesterday, I think people have been incredibly responsible during this corona incident. They've, by and large, taken the government's guidelines and implemented them in full. And I think we must trust people, tell them what the dilemma here is, and say that if by loosening the thing at all, the cases start to spike again, we might have to stop, we might even have to reverse it. But let's at least give it a try. I think the real problem is, and let's be absolutely honest about this, we're going to have to live with this virus until we get a vaccine or drugs that can treat it. And only a comparatively small proportion of the population have yet to be exposed to it. So their bodies have no antibodies to it. And therefore, I think if we're not going to suffer a huge long-term permanent damage to this economy and the consequent loss of jobs, we've got to start to lift the lockdown.
Okay. Before I get prompted by the Barn Theatre, I think we should get back to the questions, because that's what people are...
But I wanted to set the scene, David.
I know. And interestingly, the questions now turn to some of the issues that the two of you have already started to address. But this isn't just about business and restarting the economy. I should also say this isn't just about Cirencester. And next week, before we get emails in and live streaming, we will have features on both Tetbury and Fairford and Lechlade, and grateful to those two communities, business communities, who are going to contribute next week. So this gives us a take on Cirencester, our capital, but three other key settlements are going to be here next week talking to us. The next question is from Peter Bailey. Sir Geoffrey, according to the ONS, 3,372 people had died with COVID-19 by the end of March. Of these, 2,068 were men. Of these, only 30 men under 60 and without underlying health conditions had died. Given the overall mortality is a few percent, and that all of those deaths, approximately 1.5%, are healthy working-age men with a correspondingly low fraction of women, then one infers that the risk to healthy working-age people is very low. And those are national figures. And they should be freed now to get back to work and get the economy moving again. This is doubly important since the cost of the stoppage is becoming crippling to the economy, and that the cost can only be borne by those of working age, which is a really important point. Those who are most vulnerable must protect themselves at their own risk, as they are the ones who impose most demands on the NHS and will not in the end be seriously disadvantaged by the economic catastrophe. So Peter's saying that there's a possibility of putting younger people back to work. So would you like to respond to that, and then I'll ask Mark if he thinks that's feasible?
Well, I'd wholly endorse the sentiment that, of course, we want to get young people back to work as quickly as possible. But I don't think it's quite as simple as Peter makes out, because a lot of those people will be going home and maybe living with elderly residents or whatever. And the moment you start to get people together in any quantities, there is obviously more risk of the disease passing from one to another, and that's the problem with schools. So I hear the sentiment that Peter says. I think we just need to be cautious, but on the other hand, we mustn't be too cautious and do nothing. We just need to keep slowly opening up the whole thing.
Okay. Do you have anything to add to that about young people going back to work, Mark?
Well, I certainly share Geoffrey's view that until a vaccine, a viable vaccine or drug to treat the condition is is found, we're in this for the long haul. There is no, and if that means current levels of lockdown are maintained until a viable vaccine is found, then strikes me there won't be anything left of an economy by the end of it. So, and presumably then there will be all sorts of other issues that society is having to deal with that go way beyond the hospitalisation and deaths that are directly linked to the virus. Of course, any death is tragic and would want to be avoided, but I think a balance has to be struck somewhere. And it comes back to us all being responsible, doesn't it? And I guess we can all make a decision whether we feel comfortable stepping out of our houses and going back to work in some way, shape, or form, or do we want to stay at home?
Okay. Right. Thank you for that. I've got several taskmasters here. I've got the Barn Theatre, I've got Clifton-Brown, I've also got the live stream. So I've got a lady here who's saying, if you do not get on with the questions, you'll run out of time. You did start late. So, Barn, I hope we'll be able to carry on a little bit longer to get through these questions. Thank you for telling me that, Rosemary. I'll crack on as quickly as I can. Next question is from Catherine Pullum, who is the finance director of Pullum & Sons in Bourton on the Water, and they are a coach company, and they are saying that their job is to transport thousands of tourists around the Cotswolds on their bus services and many more incoming tourists from all over the world. And they feel that tourism and leisure businesses in this area are essential, providing with essential clientele. Without these businesses and their support, businesses would not survive, and neither would we. But they feel that the government apparently exclude their business from the leisure sector. Why are Pullum & Sons being penalised for operating in an area with high rateable values, making us ineligible for business rates, relief and grants?
Well, Catherine, we met in Bourton on the Water. I have every sympathy with you. Part of your business is related to tourism, and part of your business is related to everyday transport of local people about their daily business. I hadn't heard of your problems until you posed the question, and I'm more than happy to take it up with the Department of Transport and see what they say.
And since you've got direct contact, you're probably best to take that one directly with Catherine, because it's a very specific problem. Okay. This is even more specific. This is from Rob, who is saying, once we do reopen, will businesses be given grants to adjust their facilities? It's interesting what Mark said about fashion businesses. Maybe they do have to clean their stock and they need some money to help provide that with necessary cleaning. Because this is about touch-free toilet flushes, taps, hand wash, doors, etc. Will there be grants for equipment to allow businesses to keep employees safe and indeed customers? Do you think there might be some grant money available for that?
Well,
restarting?
I've not heard of any discussion of that sort. And I think we've got to all be a little bit conscious that we're going to end up with a vast pile of debt at the end of this whole coronavirus. And at some point, this has to be paid back either through general taxation or through growth in the economy if and when we do get growth in the economy. So I think it's very easy to promise the world, but actually in reality, we've got to be quite careful about how much more money we do spend.
Okay, that's really kind. Thank you for that. This is from Jeff Bowman, who lives in Bybury. He's an architect. On the BBC News briefing yesterday, so this was midweek, the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, said it was wholly unrealistic to expect life to suddenly return to normal soon, and that social distancing would have to be maintained until the end of the year. Surely this means that pubs and restaurants will have to remain closed and that we shall all have to remain in degrees of virtual lockdown for the rest of the year or until an effective treatment or vaccine is devised. And it's great that we've got Mark here, because perhaps you could give a take on that for Geoffrey, and then Mark might like to comment. Is it practical to reopen a business that's a hospitality business where you're serving food and drink?
Well, Geoffrey, good to hear from you. I think you've identified the absolute key dilemma for the government. They will be getting this very cautious medical advice from the medics, who obviously, as Mark has said, won't want to risk a single extra case or a single extra death. But you've got to balance that against opening the economy. and that is why I propose this step-by-step approach. I do have to be honest with you, though. I suspect, and honest with Mark too, I suspect the hospitality industry, in as far as it is in terms of restaurants and pubs, where clearly a lot of people are in close proximity with each other, I would have thought that that would probably be at the end of the chain in terms of this unlocking the current government guidelines. And I don't want to give that bad news, but I just logic would tell you that. I think there are many other things you could do first before you would be sure that it was sufficiently, reasonably safe to open clubs and pubs and restaurants.
So as a business owner in that sector, Mark, do you have a view on that?
I can understand why Geoffrey has responded the way he has, and I think you can probably sum it up in a nutshell by the blanket approach that is being enforced at the moment. And you know, with this wonderful weather we're having at the moment, we can all picture a beer garden in one of the many country pubs around the Cotswolds, where it must be perfectly safe to sit at a table and chairs out in the garden at a safe distance from other customers and be of no risk whatsoever. Yeah, there's got to be a protocol in place for getting served, but that's no different to the protocol that's being adopted at supermarkets. So I think if we can move on from the blanket approach and we can all be trusted to behave responsibly, then perhaps there is some accommodation that can be made. But I do have the same fears as Sir Geoffrey that the hospitality sector could well be the last to emerge out of this lockdown.
Thank you for that. This is a question that's come in relation to geography and the geographical spread of coronavirus in the UK, and it's from Nick Brown. Dear Sir, there seems to be far less infections, in the southwest Wales and the east of England than other parts of the UK. Is it time for the government to consider a retail response to this crisis? Whilst you wouldn't want to risk a rise in COVID, a travel restriction could remain in place. There could be an easing of restrictions to allow some small businesses and sporting pursuits to start up before waiting for the London bubble on which the whole of the UK's advice seems to be based. So that's interesting, London versus the rest, which is a geographical approach to this rather than an age approach. Do you think that's possible?
Well, I think looking at the figures, and I'm no expert in this disease, but what it does appear is that the larger cities and the areas close by to the larger cities are those areas in the country where are getting the highest rate of cases. So that probably accounts for why we in the southwest are getting less. And actually you see it even in the figures in the southwest. Gloucestershire has one of the highest figures because it's closer to Birmingham and London, whereas Cornwall, which is further away, has one of the lowest figures. And the same with the east and the same with Wales. So I think what one would have to be very careful on any sort of regional approach is if you start to allow people to travel widely about the countryside, which is of course why we had the row about second homes, I think then you could be risking the spread of it. So I take the point about the region, but the region is only as they are because they are further away from the big cities, and we need to guard against any huge amount of interaction between people, between the two.
Mark, do you think it's feasible to go for a geographical approach? Or?
I guess it's my same comment about the blanket approach. I think if we can start to be more articulate in the way we enforce it, it's always going to have to be trial and error, isn't it? We're going to have to see as we go and understand what the reaction is and accept that the restrictions may be reimposed, but if you don't try it, you'll never know.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think that's a really important point, David, if I may say so, that Mark's just made. We may have to, if we do the step-by-step approach and we suddenly find that there's a spike from some particular restriction we've lifted, we may have to be prepared to go back. But if you don't take the risk in the first place, you'll never know.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I'm going to try and break with our approach previously, because the questions come in and we have no way of monitoring whether they're about business or they're about health. I'm going to try and pick up the questions that are business related, so that, and then we could perhaps end on some of the more general questions. So if you could bear with me, I'd be grateful. However, I do want to just have a small interruption. On the one hand, A message from Harry Coots, Sir Geoffrey, watching from the farmhouse in Dorchester. Hope you're keeping well and keep up the good work. All right.
Well done, Harry. Thank you.
There's another one, though, which is the opposite to this. Live with Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown. No thanks. I've got enough going on living with 3 kids. So that's the
well,
flip
that's
side.
the great thing about this country. It's a democracy. We can free to do what we like, COVID
As ever, you
notwithstanding.
give a great answer. Right. The questions about the issue here to do with business. Mark Tomlinson, can you support the decision to reverse the council tax increase for 2021, referring back to 2019, 2020 pricing, supporting the suspension of council tax increase? So that's related to both residential and business support. Do you have got a view on that? Something you could discuss with Joe? I know it would play havoc with their budgets, and indeed the lockdown is doing that already, but would that help?
There is the £150 available to those that are most affected by the council tax at the moment, and I'm keen to know how many of those grants are being given out by the district council. I think there's going to be an awful lot of discussion on council tax and business rates when this whole thing is over. The district council previously had plans to increase car parking charges. I'm busily saying don't increase car parking charges too quickly. The one thing we do want to do is encourage people to, when the restrictions are lifted, we want to encourage people to come and start the retail sector up again.
That's great. I mean, what do you think? I think I know the answer that you're going to give, Mark, but taking both those things, council tax increase and car parking increases, I'm assuming your view would be, yes, if we can reverse the decision to increase them, that would ease the burden on you and indeed a number of your tenants.
Well, I've been lobbying for some time now against the current business rate structure in the UK. I believe it's archaic, particularly when it comes to town centres. It's punitive. It's not realistic in terms of where values really are, and I didn't get round to raising the question, Geoffrey, at our first Q&A in here, but I wanted to say that when all this lockdown is over, when we're getting back to normality, I do think governments around the world now really need to start grappling with the issue of properly taxing online businesses compared to physical premises, because I just think it's totally unfair, it's not balanced, and I understand why there are challenges in taxing businesses like Amazon correctly. I understand why in their online status they can be creative in the way they structure their businesses from a tax perspective, but there is no getting away from the fact that business rates at the moment are just not a fair way of taxing business as a whole. As far as car parking is concerned, yeah, it goes without saying we need to make it as attractive as possible for people to come into not just Cirencester but all of the Cotswold towns. And there needs to be an adequate provision of car parking in the right location, but that's probably not for today's discussion.
Well, in fairness to the leaders of the district council, I do remember listening to Mike Evermy on the district council live stream where he said he'd already instructed the officers to look at the budget because he reckoned that for every month that we're in lockdown, that CDC is losing £330,000 a month, £250,000 against their revenue budget. And so clearly they're going to have to do some major restructuring and looking at some of their capital projects as well as where they're looking at sourcing their income and be supportive of what needs to be done in the business. So an interesting question from Amanda Jane Davis. We'll listen and keep an open mind about the debate, but I'm hearing far more concern about phasing out of lockdown too soon. So this is the other end of the spectrum. Mark made the comment about Cheltenham races, and I know a number of other hotels in the area had a spike whereby they got terrific occupancy levels, if that's the correct term, Mark, because we had Cheltenham Races was open, but there's a view that Cheltenham Races was another example of where technically it should have been allowed, but it was questioned in terms of the impact on a Cheltenham cluster of COVID-19 cases. I hope to hear Sir Geoffrey taking a balanced view and approach where the residents' and employees' concerns are taken as seriously as business owners. Not too soon in capital letters, please, else it will hurt the economy more in the long term, which is a good perspective. Do you have a view on Amanda Jane's?
I think we have tried to reflect that very difficult decision the government has to take. The easy decision would be not to lift the restrictions until we had a vaccine. That's the easy decision. But actually, if we do that, it would completely wreck the economy. And if you wreck the economy, as Marcus so rightly said earlier, there would then be all sorts of other consequences, like mental health problems and all sorts of problems. And vast numbers of people would lose their jobs permanently, which would have effect on their livelihood and their families. So I think this is a very difficult balance, but one that the government has got to be prepared to take a bit of a risk in order to try and get us back to normality.
Mark, do you think Cheltenham do you think Cheltenham should have been cancelled, basically, in the light of what happened?
Well, I was at the festival on the Tuesday and the Friday, and I have to say there was a palpable difference across the course of the week. By the Friday, I certainly felt guilty being there and that it shouldn't really be going ahead. Having said that, I had cause to be at Cheltenham General Hospital last week, and the doctor that attended to me told me that I think there were at that point there were a total of 130 cases of COVID-19 across Cheltenham and Gloucester hospitals. So I've heard rumours that there was a real spike in cases of the virus around the Cheltenham area as a result of the festival. I'm not sure whether that was or wasn't the case. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge event. I certainly don't comment from a selfish perspective in relation to the King's Head Hotel, but I can understand the difficulties at such a late point in the process. And it's easy for us all to forget how quickly this whole lockdown emerged. You know, I was holding daily meetings in the hotel, and from one day to the next, it was a completely different picture. Just quickly going back to the parking point, what I would say is that there are still traffic wardens patrolling the streets of the centre of Cirencester, and why on earth they can't be furloughed and a more relaxed environment adopted is beyond me.
I suppose traffic wardens are monitoring car parking in the wrong places rather than people who haven't paid, because it's all free parking in Cirencester at the moment. So that's an interesting point. We should pass that back to Councillor Harris, because it might be that he's doing something else other than watching us.
I'm quite happy to forward my ticket.
Are you? You got?
I think there was a picture in the paper of a parking warden.
Was there? Okay.
Yeah.
I have to say that this sounds like we go to the races and go to the rugby. I went to the rugby on the Saturday, and I came by some tickets because the people who were going to go didn't want to go because of coronavirus. I got to the ground and there was one hand sanitizer in the south entrance, and people were just laughing and joking. That was on the Saturday, and a week later we were in lockdown. So, and Boris was actually there. Not that he was in the decent seats and I was in the cheap seats, but it's amazing how quickly it all moved, and staggering that we should go. What I was going to suggest now, because we are well up on the questions and I'm keeping a ready check on what's going on here, I'd just like to say hello to Lisa McKee, who's telling me hello from Renkham. I don't know who you are, but it would be nice to have a question from you, Lisa. We've got a video that we'd just like to show, which is how Cirencester has been dealing with coronavirus. And I'd like to introduce in this video two people who are key to Cirencester's current handling of the situation. It's about 10 minutes long, but it is well worth looking, because the reason being is that it shows how we've moved from a position of being really frightened and really scared to what's called a series of waves, and we're now at the next wave, and how people are responding to this. So if we could cut to the video and then come back to the questions. Thank you very much. Welcome everybody. I'm delighted to introduce today Rob Duggan and Claire Bloomer, who are responsible for setting up the Cirencester Community Response Facebook page. Claire is also the Deputy Mayor of Cirencester and a District and Town Councillor. So welcome to you both. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to talk to us. Could I ask you both the first question, which is, what's the background to setting up the Cirencester Community Response COVID-19 Facebook page?
I think I'll grab that one if you don't mind. Thank you very much for inviting us on. That's really it's really nice to be able to come and share a little bit of our story. The background to this is really a desire, much like every other community around the country, to set up something that was going to respond to the community needs. I've been working with some organisations that have been seeing some of the early data, and I could see that there was definitely a requirement for that kind of community effort to come in. And we worked with, we looked at a way of providing, or the desire was to provide a safeguarded method for people to be able to get involved with their community. And I wanted to join something that had a little bit more than just a few neighbours knocking on doors. I wanted to make sure that we had some kind of proper structure, and I wanted to get involved with that sort of organisation. Looking out there at the very early days, that wasn't really available, so decided to have a crack at setting something up. And I went out and I spoke to lots of individuals that knew a lot more than me. I came to Claire and said, hey, listen, we've got this great idea. But I want to say that what we've got today in terms of the organisation is very much bigger than just a Facebook page. We have a website, we have a telephone number, we have Twitter. We've got lots of people and individuals involved in running that. But the original idea really was to come together to provide some kind of organisation to the community efforts that were needed to support people through this COVID-19 crisis. And not to get in the way of other charities or other services. Very much the case is to try and work in parallel with those and to augment, but certainly not to confuse people and get in that way. And that's why we very much head everything we do with the Gloucestershire Help Hub to allow them to make a safeguarding service. But I mean, in the early days, I had a great idea. I had an idea. I came to Claire. I said, "Listen, really want to start to get this off the ground." And she worked with, I think, her colleague Lorna from Big Yellow Marketing, and fabulously, this Facebook page sprung up, and the community started to come together. And then, obviously, we took lots of advice from other organisations like. I have to thank GL11. I've got to thank the Fairford model. I have to thank Fran at the Churn, who's been giving me some great advice and helping provide input to make sure we're doing the right things and not stepping on toes. So the original idea was a very small, I'd like to help people. We want to get something off the ground, and it's just really blown up from there.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Rob. And Claire, how is it actually structured in Cirencester? Because Rob's explained that it's more than just a Facebook page. Could you give us a flavour of how it's structured?
So it took a while to get it set up, but the plan was to divide the town into 8 wards as it is within the town council. And so for each area, so we've got 8 wards across Cirencester. And for each ward, we've got 2 volunteer coordinators. Most of the volunteer coordinators are actually town councillors. And then what happens is when we get a call to action, we notify the volunteer coordinator, who then finds the relevant volunteer to help with a person in need. And it seems to be working fairly well.
Okay, so that leads me neatly on to the next question, which I know both of you want to reply, which, how do you think it's working? I mean, what sort of numbers are we looking at? Can you give us a flavour of how it's working?
I think for me, I'll start very quickly by saying that how's it working is going to change over the next few weeks and months. The reality is that in the early days, there was a very high level of anxiety about how to address short-term need. How am I going to get my food? How am I going to get my prescriptions? And while some of that is still coming to bear, people understand there are services out there that can help now. So the level of need in the very early days was to get those kinds of tasks organised and done. And that was quite high to start with. And as we've seen over the last few weeks, that level of need is dropping quite considerably. It's getting quieter and quieter. But this is a long-term game, and volunteers' availability is going to change, and the phases of the approach is going to change. So in the next phase, we are thinking about how do we adapt the things that we are doing, and how do we change some of the services we're doing to make them more relevant to the community. We're throwing some ideas around at the moment about different services we can go out there, and we're always listening to find out how the needs are changing. Phase 2 and phase 3, I really are going to be. People are thinking about their long-term welfare and certainly the financial situations, that kind of thing. So for me, it was quite a high need to start with. It seems to be dropping off. I don't want to put any numbers around that right now. We actually report those numbers into the council. But yeah, I see it as an ongoing, and I see it coming in waves of need at the moment, if I'm honest.
Okay, so that's brilliant. What, have you got anything to add to that, Claire?
No, I agree with Rob. I think we've had to learn as we've gone along, and we've had so much support from different people, which has been fantastic. But yeah, as Rob has mentioned, we are keeping the figures So we'll be able to look back and see where we helped and what and who we helped.
Okay, that's brilliant. You mentioned earlier about the input that you'd had from other towns and experience like Fairford. But how can those towns and other communities take advantage of the model that's being created in Cirencester?
We went down a slightly different track to those guys, but with the help of some great people just giving some input outside and some mentorships, certainly to me. I mean, I'm not an expert at this. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this in terms of setting up a group. My expertise was more the digital kind of side to start with, and I made sure that the tools that we have in place, like our email systems, we have mailing lists, tool sets, we have communication tool sets. So we've got free licenses coming at us from lots of awesome organisations like Zoho, Typeform. We've got MailChimp and loads of others that are giving us that kind of tool set. So we're certainly able to leverage those tools. But also we have a really large pool of resources and volunteers. And actually, we've learned a huge amount from those other organisations, to be fair. We've actually learned from them and built them into the things that we're doing. I think we just have a little bit more breadth and scale, that it seems, than some of the other guys right now. I don't think that necessarily means we're more effective. I just think we have a bit more resilience. So if the guys needed a bit of extra support, we're certainly there to do that. And we try and work with anybody that wants to come in and leverage that kind of stuff. We're really happy to put our teams and our knowledge to work around it for them. So it's more about, I think there's a two-way street that we can learn off each other there.
That's great. Claire, do you want to add anything, or you?
Yeah, I again, I agree with what Rob says, but I know, for instance, that Rob has just been fantastic in joining different people into this group, so we're not confusing people, which I think is really important. And we've taken on Siddington as well, so we've been helping Siddington. I know that Rob's been working with them, and Gary Selwyn from Watermoors had a bit of crossover with Siddington, so that's working really well.
Okay, that's great. Which kind of leads me on to the next question, which is looking at the future and future proofing, because I know that's something that's dear to both your hearts, because as you said, this isn't just about coronavirus, this is just about what's going to happen afterwards, going forward. You're in it for the long term. So any lessons that we could learn?
One of the original factors when we set this up was safeguarding, but we wanted to document what we did. There was very much a case of nobody really had faced before in our lifetime, or there was any documentation. I think we've forgotten a little bit about how resilient communities are. So we have some fantastic people across Cirencester and across the UK as a whole. And actually, there's hyper-local issues get solved by hyper-local groups. And we forget that when we're looking at, when we've been in our day-to-day lives before, I think, and we look at government kind of initiatives to try and drive things forward. For me, I wanted to document what we were doing. I wanted to understand the impact and the needs that we were seeing. And then I wanted to package that up and give it back to the council. And that is something that we are actively doing right now. We continue to refine that. I've got an amazing lady on the team who's a project manager, is helping really refine a lot of that so we can give it back to the council. So long term, we hope to give a package to say, not necessarily to say, look, this is how you should do it, but you can use the community, and the community will give you an amazing response to these kinds of situations. This is a structure that worked last time. If it's applicable, resource it.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah. Have you got any thoughts on that, Claire?
Yeah, I mean, obviously all the town councillors are involved in this, and it's lovely. A lot of them are saying how great it is to have such a fantastic community of Cirencester, and the people that our councillors are speaking to, because everybody who volunteers, everybody who needs help, has a phone call from a local town councillor or a volunteer coordinator. And I think on the other side of this, I think it could really help the community in Cirencester in growing more community groups and just getting more of a community scale. We've got a great one already, but I think this could actually make it even better.
That's great. And last question, because I know you've got to go, Rob. What message, because we're here with our MP and he's always keen to get a view on what he can take back to central government. So have you got a message for Westminster to give our MP?
I think I've certainly, I know I've got one that's top of my mind at the moment, and that is that the needs of the community is now evolving. We are moving from that initial anxiety mode and short-term need to a long-term goal, and we are going to see a financial impact on members of our society that have never needed support before. And the level of information that is there, the level of support that is there, I think currently today, I personally feel is maybe slightly inadequate, and it certainly isn't going to cope with the torrent and the thousands, tens of thousands of families, millions even, that are going to need additional support and advice around long-term financial planning to deal with the impact of this. We're going to see lots of people with job losses. We're going to see the economy fundamentally change as we come out of this, and we need to resource ready to advise and guide people at that point.
Yeah, well, I know that the MP is really keen to try and get that balance right between protecting people and how we go about restarting the economy. Have you got any thoughts, Claire?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that I've heard, and one of my main things is we've got these fantastic hubs across the country. We've got the Gloucestershire hub, and they've got a helpline number. And the one thing I'd love to see on the news that is on all the time about COVID-19 would be to actually highlight these telephone numbers for each area. I'm sure that they could have something across the bottom highlighting those telephone numbers. There are plenty of elderly people out there that might not have access to the internet. And it might be one of the things they do have is a TV, and they watch the news, and just to be able to call somebody, I think it's really, really important.
Well, we're going to in future on our live streams put some phone numbers up as well. So can I thank you both for what you're doing on behalf of the community, and thank your other colleagues, all the councillors and all the volunteers, making this such a success, and wish you both a great weekend, and stay safe and stay healthy, and we'll stay in touch. Thanks a lot to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Rob. I know Geoffrey always likes to comment after these video interviews. You've got a quick comment to make about what you've heard about the Cirencester community response, particularly looking at future-proofing?
Yes, I mean, you've both highlighted absolutely the kernel of the dilemma. We need to balance the medical risk against the long-term future to the economy and trying to get businesses like yours up and running. And I've heard loud and clear what you have to say. And I'm very grateful for all the work that you're doing in Cirencester. And Claire, I've taken that point on board about the hubs. We MPs have got a conference call this coming week with the LEP, who by and large sponsor the hubs, and I will be raising that issue with them when I have that call. But thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Geoffrey. And moving back to the questions, we've got 10 minutes left. But we will be playing out with a video from the north of the Cotswolds and a really good vox pop from Tetbury in the south of the Cotswolds, looking at how businesses are faring. So although we're ending the Q&A in 10 minutes, we are racking through these questions really quickly, and hopefully we are going to get them all done. A question for Sir Geoffrey on the issue of transparency. How can we be confident that the daily confirmed cases figure being published doesn't just reflect the number of tests being received back, and they reflect for at least a proportion of the number of people in our communities that are now being infected? That's a difficult one. You can only surely rely on the tests. Have you a view?
Well, exactly, and that is one of the reasons why the tests have been more difficult to get up to the numbers than we thought. It's because we want to make them reliable. And the problem with the tests is until we get this antibody test, which is whether you've actually had the virus, the other antigen test tells you whether you've got the disease at that particular moment, but it doesn't tell you whether you're about to get it or whether you or whatever. So the testing's all very well, but it's only part of the story.
Okay. Next one related to PPE. Any planning to basically supply PPE from the domestic market? Because you talked about the competitive environment that we're in with PPE, but any thoughts from central government on the domestic market?
Sure. I've passed through a few constituency and Gloucestershire suppliers to the relevant authorities. The difficulty for them is that they've got to be absolutely certain before they go into any contract with anybody that what they're supplying conforms to the relevant standards, because the worst thing of all would be to have protective clothing that didn't actually protect against the disease. So it isn't quite as simple as it sounds.
Okay, interesting. Next question from Amanda Jane, who's got lots of questions. So thank you for your continued questionings, Amanda. She said, let's have the DPH or similar clinical public health expert on with Sir Geoffrey soon. And what were you saying just before about having a doctor here to ask them questions? Would you like to comment on that? That's certainly your
I
hope.
think that's quite right, Amanda. It would be really useful, and we will, in our planning in the next few weeks, have a doctor or a nurse or somebody who's been, maybe a team of them, who, provided we can do social isolating, who have been absolutely at the front line of all of this, and just to hear from them of their experiences. But again, we cannot too often reiterate our thanks to these people who've been risking their own lives and working hugely long hours under difficult circumstances.
Okay, another suggestion for the future, which is again from Amanda, briefing the ministerial team on a Q&A with children. I know you and I have been trying to get children and teenagers to respond to this, but again, we're thinking about doing something on education and children hopefully next week, aren't we?
We are. I will be doing some work this coming week to find out exactly what is going on in schools, how many teachers are setting their children and pupils' work, and getting them to do the work and then having it back online and marking it with comments. This does seem to me a useful way that we could use some of this time under lockdown.
Okay, this is a plea from all of us here at the barn, which is if you have children in your household or teenagers or students who want to ask questions directly of Sir Geoffrey or indeed through the contact number for Cotswold Speaks, we'd love to hear from you. But it's quite difficult to elicit that information. We need you to respond, and we'd be delighted to have you contribute to this process. Absolutely, moving forward. Stephen Andrews, we need to share best practice between community COVID-19 mutual aid groups so that we are better prepared for emergencies. I think we've covered that off. Amanda Jane, again, like the suggestion of publicising helpful phone numbers, which is great. Thank you for that. That covers the live stream. We're now just going to end with a few questions that were left over from the contact number. First is from Joy Wardle. She's saying, why have the government not done enough to get more PPE for both the NHS and care homes? The NHS have asked the government's permission to allow Burberry and Barbour to go ahead with making PPE, and these companies are ready and willing to make these items. So why does the government seem to be dragging its feet? This is about domestic market, which I think you've already...
Again, I've covered this. I mean, we'd love to get PPE from anybody who's able to supply it. But we've got to be sure that they do manufacture it to the required standards.
Interesting thing from Bridget Baxter, which I've shared with Councillor Nigel Moore earlier, and he's going to take it up with the County Council. She's saying the roads are very quiet at the moment, so could you ask Sir Geoffrey if it would be possible to get on with the potholes? We've forgotten about potholes and car parking until it was mentioned earlier, but potholes. Why can't we fill in all the potholes in the roads while they're nice and quiet? It wouldn't be so. It seems to me to be an ideal time to let the guys socially isolate and get on with filling potholes.
Well,
do you have a view?
Just as somebody raised the issue of mental health, is the Mental Health Trust last week gearing up to possible mental health problems after this virus is all over. In my conference call with the health chiefs and the County Council, I took it up immediately and was told, yes, the Mental Health Trust is thinking about this, and I will do exactly the same with the Chief Executive of the County Council and ask him about potholes in a few minutes' time.
Okay, and Nigel...
Instantaneous response for you.
Okay, and more than that, Nigel Moore, Councillor for Stowe Division in the North, has also said that in his briefing next week he's going to devote his session to an update on potholes. So that's great, some real action here. So thank you for that. Comment, I'm afraid, from a lady called Rachel Greatorex Jones, who said, why has the UK become the sick man of Europe, with our death toll set to exceed that of our European partners? Do you have a view? I mean, the sick man of Europe has a historical economic connotation, which we can remember some of us from the past. But do you feel that we're seen as the sick man of Europe?
Well, I think that the disease has been fairly prevalent here. And one of the reasons it has is that we're one of the most open countries in the world. And we could be criticised. Perhaps we could have locked things down much quicker, much harder, and maybe would have, maybe, I don't know, maybe we would have saved some of the cases, but we are a free society, and I think we've probably got the balance about right.
Great. Just got two more things, Sir Geoffrey. The first is, I hate to say it, but it's the issue bringing it all back home to waste, the waste service, which the district council are responsible for, as you know. They're responsible for collecting it. The county council are responsible for disposing of it. This is written on behalf of Cotswold residents. Dear Sir Geoffrey, I wrote to you last week to see if we could lobby the CDC to reintroduce their garden waste service because it had ceased when it was needed most, and it was blamed on excuses of lack of trained staff, health and safety issues, and so on. Given Yubico is operating elsewhere in Gloucestershire, why not here? I'm sitting at home today and staggered to see a Yubico lorry in the village, and I rushed out to not only applaud the crew, who were great, but to ask them what they were collecting. Black bins, they said. I replied, oh, I had no warning you were coming today. There's no information on the website. The fact that in the street there were lots of green bins, plenty of food caddies, but precious few black bins should have said something. The waste service is in meltdown. It is now a lottery, not a service. Please, please, please ask Councillor Harris and Councillor Doherty to stop giving us excuses or platitudes and collect the waste. It's easy for me to sit here and say that. I'm not providing that service or running the council, but I know that Councillor Richard Morgan has been in touch with you, and there's quite a lot of stuff on social media at the moment. I know the County Council are keen to lobby for this. What is happening to the green waste service?
Well, I have taken it up with the District Council. I have pointed out to them that it's only Cotswold and Tewkesbury in the entire county of Gloucestershire that is not collecting green waste. I have also told them that Yubico have had no problem in recruiting extra drivers to replace the ones that are social isolating. So I'm not quite sure what the problem is. I do know, to be fair to the District Council, that we've all generated huge amounts of increased food waste and cardboard and plastic recycling because we've all stayed at home that much longer. But nevertheless, I think the time has come where we need to have the green waste restored because people need to get rid of their garden waste. I also think that the government are putting pressure on the county councils to consider opening the household recycling units fairly soon. And the county council are worried that if Cotswold don't open their green waste, we will have a whole lot of people with garden waste taking them to the household recycling centres, and that will not be helpful either. So I think the whole issue of waste needs carefully looking at by both councils, but particularly we need to restore that garden green waste.
Mark, I know it's not a strictly business-related question, but you're here as a local resident, and I wondered whether you've got a view on the waste service generally and garden waste. Would you like to comment on it?
I'm not sure about garden waste particularly, but we tried to use the Foss Cross Recycling Centre the other day. Apparently it was showing on the website as being open. It's still in lockdown. And I can't see why centres like that can't operate a socially distanced policy like supermarkets and continue to function. And yeah, we're all producing more waste, including recycled waste at home, and I would have thought we're capable of disposing of it responsibly if the right protocol is in place at the recycling centres.
That's great. Okay, one last thing before we say goodbye to both of you and hand over to the Barn Theatre to show us the video for the North and the South Cotswolds, the North being a quick report by Councillor Nigel Moore and the South being a really good and interesting vox pop by Councillor Rick Morgan, who went round Tetbury and socially distancing but getting feedback from local businesses and some really interesting stuff there. So we're talking about other towns, which is great. So please stay tuned to this. But the last thing was to leave you with a thought, Sir Geoffrey. There's a growing debate locally, and you may well have had people contact you directly. I've seen one or two emails to this effect, that we ought to start thinking about recognising the contributions that people are making, whether it's frontline staff in hospitals, doctors in ICU, through to people running banks, running businesses, our refuse collection service, to see whether we can recognise that in some formal way and whether there's any debate taking place within central government on that subject. By this I mean possibly creating a medal or a series of medals to recognise that huge sacrifice, particularly thinking about the people who've lost their lives, because there are people today who are going into situations at work who know that they stand a chance of losing their life. And to me, that's akin to being in a wartime situation. I wondered whether, firstly, is there a view from central government? But if not, could we lobby you with some ideas to take it up with central government? Because we'd like to say thank you, the people of the Cotswolds, to all those people who are looking after us.
Yes, I've heard of no discussion going on in central government, but I would think it's an incredibly good idea to recognise those in those frontline services who've given service over and beyond what could possibly be normally expected, and their particularly brave and selfless work could be recognised. So, sure, I will pass that idea on. Thank you.
And one of our councillor colleagues said to me earlier, well, if central government can't do it, there's absolutely no reason why we in the Cotswolds cannot issue some kind of award that people can wear with pride to say thank you in a very formal way for years to come. Could I thank you both tremendously for being here, as ever, Sir Geoffrey, and for your continued support and work on behalf of residents. Can I thank you, Mark, for joining us as well? We're obviously now working on next week's live stream. Believe it or not, we've answered all the questions that we've received. So looking forward to getting more for next week. But thank you both, gentlemen, for your time. And thank you again to the Barn Theatre for giving us this wonderful facility and your continued support. Have a great weekend.
Well done, everybody. Thank you, David. Thank you, the Barn.
Thank you.
Good afternoon to our guest, Councillor Nigel Moore, County Councillor and Cabinet Member for the Environment and Planning. He represents Cotswolds Stowe Division in the north of the Cotswolds, and he's our regular guest representing the north, and we're delighted to have him here. So welcome back, Nigel, after last week. Have you had a good week?
Yes, I have, David. I've been working with GCC officers. What we're trying to do is support the districts, because we have this really important curbside waste collection services, which I'm really pleased to say right across the counties is proceeding as much as possible as normal. We have to ensure that we continue to recycle bottles, cardboard, paper, and also that our waste to energy plant at Javelin Park, that all is functioning as well as possible. And I have to say, right across the county, the curbside collection teams have done a splendid job.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because last week we had someone come on, and I haven't mentioned this to you before, but someone came on with a question saying, is there enough waste going to Javelin Park in the current climate because of commercial waste reductions? But can you reassure everybody that Javelin Park is working and you're comfortable that it's getting the energy it needs?
Absolutely, because
it needs to generate the energy, yeah?
Javelin Park was predicated on taking all the household waste from right across the county, and the household waste is still continuing at
great,
almost normal levels.
Okay. Have you got any updates on, because there have been some issues in Cotswolds with regards to the collection of green waste? Do you know what the update is on that? Because I think you've been lobbying yourself to sort that out, haven't you?
Yes, I've been looking into that. The announcement by the Health Secretary last night about self-testing is important, because what we're looking at is to see whether or not we can introduce that with the crews across the county. This could be a way of ensuring that we get as many possible people back to work.
That's brilliant. As we discussed last week, we're sort of using this as an opportunity to get an update from you on issues that you think you'd like to highlight for not only the folk in the north, but obviously the whole of the district. So I gather you've got an update for us on community transport, and I wondered if you could let us know what's been going on and your efforts on that front.
Yes, I mean, being a rural area, particularly the North Cotswolds, but most of the Cotswolds, because we don't have a strong public transport network, community transport is absolutely key, particularly for the elderly. People wanting to get to GP visits and also hospital visits. Fortunately, before the emergency started, we'd already increased the budgets for the 4 services operating in the North Cotswolds. That's Community Connections, Cotswold Friends, the Hedgehog and the Villager services. So they were in a good position to respond. And to give you some figures, in the first 2 weeks of the emergency, Cotswold Friends dealt with over 5,000 inquiries for various forms of help. And if I can just put up this little card, this help card, which gives telephone numbers for people wanting to get in touch with them. In 2 days, they distributed 20,000 of these cards across the North Cotswolds. They depend very much on volunteers, and they're actually getting more and more people volunteering to help them. So community transport is one of those, I suspect, like village shops, it's one of those things that's going to come out of this emergency stronger than it went into it.
Yeah, a small aside on village shops, because as you know, I used to have one, and someone said to me, wouldn't it have been great if you still had it, David? I said, yes, it would have been, but it wasn't for the previous 5 years, but I wish I had one at the moment, because I'd be very popular. But
yes, our village shop in Blockley is doing a splendid job.
Your village shop in Blockley is special. It's interesting that you should talk about phone numbers, because we had a speaker on earlier who was saying that a lot of people who are vulnerable and elderly were so focused on social media and the internet that we forget that there are people for whom the phone number, the telephone number and the telephone is a lifeline, and we need to remember that in our communication and to make sure numbers are available. She's got some quite interesting ideas, so it's great that you were showing us that card just now. Getting people phone numbers is really important. As you know, our MP has been thinking about how we can restart our economy here in the Cotswolds and obviously nationally, but at the same time to try and keep our population safe. And of course in the Cotswolds it's very important because we have a significant proportion of our population who are elderly and vulnerable, but at the same time we have a lot of people who need to work and want to work. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, I do. I'm very, very pleased, actually. I heard Geoffrey on the radio yesterday. I'm very pleased that he's in a sense come out on this, because it takes someone like him with his considerable experience. He's probably one of our longest serving MPs now, so he's seen a whole succession of crises at one time or another during his career, that he's come out to raise these questions, because we do need to raise questions. I have 3 daughters. 2 of my daughters are furloughed, and they're both very anxious about when they will be able to get back to work, and I'm sure that's multiplied a million times across the country. I think the public response to the close down has been extraordinary. It's been incredibly disciplined. The downside to that, I suspect, is that the impact on the economy was never predicted to be as substantial as it's been, because the shutdown has been so well respected, but it's had this huge hit on our economy. And I think Geoffrey's right to raise the questions. It's got to be phased, but I, for one, think it's time now we began to look at this and just see how we can get, on a measured basis, some people back to work.
It's interesting you say that, because we've had questions in from people who are saying if you look at the data on people who've tested positive and sadly people who've died, there is a regional trend, and in the southwest we're very fortunate in Gloucestershire that we haven't had any death is tragic, but we haven't had as many people as some of the major conurbations die here. But also looking at age profiles and finding that young people are less vulnerable to this than old people. I know young people have died, but by and large the stats are that young men and young women are stronger in this situation than, say, someone like me, who's a bit older. So I do think Geoffrey's right to raise it, and it's great that someone with your profile in the county is behind that initiative. And I think we've got to have the debate, and it's important that we have the debate, but we mustn't lose sight of the fact that there are people out there who are still scared, still very vulnerable, and but we do need to move forward. And thank you very much for your views and for your time. And are you happy to come on next week and give us another perspective on things as things progress? Now,
yes, I am, David. I enjoy these sessions, and it's great to be able to share what we're doing right across the district.
Yeah, and it's great that you've now got Zoom on your mobile. This is a whole new experience for us. So thank you very much for coming on. I wish you a very happy and safe weekend, and we'll look forward to speaking to you next week. Okay? Take care.
Yeah, thank you, David. And I look forward to watching the programme this afternoon.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So it's Thursday the 23rd of April and it's lunchtime in Tetbury, and I'm going to use my 1 hour's exercise a day to walk around and ask small business holders how they are going in this coronavirus crisis. But you can tell just by the fact that I'm standing in the middle of the road how quiet Tetbury is at the moment. Lockdown, obviously with in a bookshop, we couldn't have customers coming through the door. And we'd always thought that there was no point in us competing against Amazon, because our kind of main point of sale or point of distinction is that we want people to come in, and that's no longer possible for us to do. So within a week we set up an online trading shop, and we've tried really, really hard to make that reflect the experience of being actually physically in the shop. So it revolves around different tables that we have here, and you can go into the shop and you can click on the tables and kind of buy whatever is selling or what we recommend. So that was our initial response, and the volume of sales we're getting through that is probably 50 to 75% of what we would normally take through the shop. So we're not up where we need to be, but it's not bad. And with that, we can kind of eke out the money that we've had from the government, from the various schemes we've had, just try and keep going for as long as we can. And what we're finding is that whilst the stock on the online shop is only what we have here, it's generating a lot of inquiries. And so for us, that's an awful lot of work, because none of the book wholesalers work anymore. We have to order direct from publishers. Penguin at the moment is taking 3 weeks to get an order out. So it's a very complicated, complex, difficult thing to do. You know, it's not rocket science, actually. We can do it, we can satisfy customer demand, and we're very happy to do that. And I just feel grateful every day that I'm able to still come to work, do what I do what I'm fairly good at, and get books out to customers. That feels really important. As a business, we're really pleased with the help and support that the government and the local district councils have been able to give us. What I think, though, is that people are looking at the sums, at the finances of it, and seeing, even given the support we've had, seeing money start to run out at the end of May and going into June and July, people are anxious and scared about what the impact is going to be on their business, and also for themselves and their personal lives. And I think if we could take some of that anxiety away and increase the amount of support, or lengthen the amount of support that we're getting for another month or two, that would take a lot of that anxiety and a lot of that stress out, and enable people to make more rational decisions about actually what is best for them and what is best for their business and what is best for the economy. Because the worst thing you can do is look at a problem when it's right in your face like that. If we can put a bit more distance in it, that would be really good for all of us.
Found that we've become more of a kind of almost like a mama papa shop. We sell a lot of butter, eggs, milk, all organic from the farm, and now we're doing quite a roaring trade in flour, which before we just sold little bags, but people going back to basics, wanting to bake for themselves. So we have probably about 8 or 9 different kinds of bread flours and flours to help them do that. So they don't have to leave they don't have to get in the car to go and get this stuff.
Markets have really struggled to get certain products like toilet rolls and flour and pasta and things. Yeah, that's always been stocked in this store. How have you managed to do that?
Well, mainly because we are a local store, a small company, and we do have great relationships with our distributors. So they have stayed faithful with us in this hard time. So we were always able to manage to keep most things in stock, even when the supermarkets were obviously hounded.
It's pretty good, really. We are closing now at 3 o'clock instead of 5 o'clock. So generally people come in for their bread. So we're pretty busy, really. It's been absolutely amazing, and they're all keeping their distance. There's been no problems whatsoever.
What we found is we have lost all of our trade customers. So the trade side of our business that we do with hotels, restaurants, pubs, events and wedding venues have all had to shut, and we've lost all of that business. There was a major concern that may be the sort of the stumbling block for us, but fortunately we have picked up a lot of retail sales, and that has been the saving grace for me.
Fantastic. And are there any ways that you've adapted your business to deal with the coronavirus crisis?
We've had to adapt majorly. We shut the shop on the first Monday of lockdown because we couldn't maintain social distance, so we stopped all customers from coming in. We switched the business to being online, click and collect, deliveries, and just trying to do as much as we can to sort of maintain the service to customers, but change the way they order by them having to order online or ringing up and placing an order over the phone. Primarily, we have to put our staff first. We need to make sure that we as a business are taking a duty of care for our staff. We have a small shop. We cannot maintain any social distancing within that shop. So for us, it's much better for us to continue the way we are and focus on selling online and selling over the phone. Saying that, I have friends, family, and many people that are in the hospitality business, and there is a massive question mark over what they can do. The longer this goes on, the longer we're going to see businesses struggling to survive. And there is just a massive question mark over what they can do. How long will they be able to continue the furlough process? How long will they be able to continue the rent and rate support? There is massive questions going on, and I just think we need a definitive answer from the government to say, what can we do and when can we sort of not go back to normal, but when can we sort of look at adapting the restaurant and hospitality side of the business to get some sort of function for them. One thing we realise is that as a business we are benefiting from the retail sales, but there are people out there that are putting their life on the line, and we want to set up an initiative to donate a bottle of wine to a key worker. So someone who's on the NHS, someone who is in the council, someone who is in the police. If people feel like actually spending £5.95 on a bottle of wine that we can pass on to someone who is on the front line, we'd love to see if we can help these guys.
You can see there are businesses in Tetbury that are adapting to coronavirus and doing really well at the moment. But as for the rest of them, I have to say it's desperately quiet. I'm sure that's reflected up and down the Cotswolds. And the overwhelming message is,